We wanted to just quickly recall the symposium and the reason behind, so that we can delve more into the paper and what we found with the paper and what the gaps are. So I think, for Meningase Alliance, it has been a kind of an opportunity to bring together our members, partners, and everyone who is doing work on transforming masculinities and working with men and boys in gender equality and social justice to kind of make this work more effective and impactful in terms of advancing gender and social justice. And in order to do that, the idea is to, bring together the practitioners, researchers, or everyone else in that category in the spectrum to come together to share, question, learn, and strengthen our knowledge base, particularly looking at the practice-oriented knowledge building process. So I think we wanted to kind of bring together this, a coalition to have a conversation on different aspects of the work we are doing. And by doing that, strengthen and facilitate relationship building as a sense of community who is involved in this work that can actually become a community that can actually work more responsibly, purposefully, and be inclusive and work in solidarity with the broader feminist, LGBTIQ, youth, and other social justice leaders, activists, and organizations. And also by doing that, to kind of inspire, we know this field is still emerging, it's evolving. We are advancing and progressing, but also at the same time learning quite a lot while we are doing this work. And by doing that, to bring an inspiration and develop a renewed commitment to make this work more political, and then develop our own strategies and ways to meet the urgencies of today's existing and emerging challenges that we are sitting with. So that's kind of why we wanted to organize the symposium, and the reason behind. So maybe in the next slide. So what with that aim, we were really, really excited, throughout. And unlike the previous symposium, as you all know already, that instead of having a 4 or 5 days of in-person gathering, because of COVID, it provided us an opportunity to make it a 7-month-long process with kind of hybrid format. With majority of it was online, but there were a few in-person gatherings happening at the country and regional level. And at the global level, there were around 178 different sessions during that period, really opening up to have over 5,000 people participate and join the conversation and sessions and contribute from the work they are doing from across 159 countries in the world. So this is so far the biggest mobilization that we were able to do as Meningase in doing that. And it had over 600 panelists and speakers from around the world. It included everyone who is interested or doing work around the aspects of transforming masculinities and all, which was a pleasure for us to be able to, and was a massive mobilization that we really think was a great opportunity for everyone, and also build relationship. And the way we were bringing that was to sort of anchor every conversation and things around these key 5 frameworks, as we call them. So make it more around, how, strengthening accountable practices in the work, and to reflect on how much of this work has been done in a very accountable way, and what has been the reflections from our feminist and LGBTIQ and young youth leaders as well on how the work is evolving. But also to look at how does feminism fit into it? How does this work become more intersectional feminists, as we keep on calling them, and embedding within the intersectionality and bringing the complexity of humans' life, so as to make it and make sure that the work becomes holistic, and then work within the framework of power with, so that we can build relationship and solidarity and aim for having sustainable and long-term transformation, and transformation of the root causes of the violence, oppression, discrimination, every inequalities and injustice we experience among different peoples around the world. But also to look at how the intersections of different forms of oppression and vulnerabilities come together and then particularly reflecting also on the power and privilege that men and boys do enjoy in a very complex way, not in a very linear. We know that in a way, and that what that means for them to be focusing and prioritizing this work in the work we are doing on gender justice. Next slide, and probably, yeah. So as you all know, again, the symposium was anchored in Rwanda. So where the original idea of having an in-person meeting was supposed to be, but we worked by anchoring it there throughout the symposium. To you, Ioni, for the next one.
Yeah, thank you. So just to summarize, the purpose of the papers is really to synthesize the discussions that took place at the symposium. No? So what insights were generated, what knowledge was generated. And each paper includes a context analysis, promising practices, lessons learned, recommendations, and key questions for further discussion. And we'll also really be diving today into those kind of key questions for going forward, and what do we kind of need to improve and strengthen in the work on engaging men in transforming masculinities. So the idea has been, and going forward, is that these papers serve as tools for Men Engage Alliance members and partners and anybody who's interested in gender transformative work on men and masculinities to advance our understandings of what the root causes of the problems are that are outlined in the papers. And to really firm our political agendas and especially our actions, because the whole Ubuntu Symposium had the intention to do state-of-the-field analysis, but also to spark further actions. No? So together with, in a way, the Ubuntu Declaration and Call to Action, these knowledge papers are part of that same package where we dive deeper into specific issue areas and what gender transformative work on men and masculinities can look like there. And next slide, Bianca. Thank you. So the 6 priority areas are, and I think we already shared those, of course, when introducing the speakers, engaging men and boys in ending gender-based violence, including violence against women and girls, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics, SOGIESC in abbreviation, peacebuilding and countering militarism, unpaid care and economies of care, men, masculinities and climate justice, and backlash and fundamentalisms. And these are really some of the kind of trends that emerge from the symposium as recurring issues that were brought forward, and which is why we thought, we need to delve deeper and synthesize the papers on these 6 kind of priority areas that emerged. And then for me, the last thing that I want to share before we finally start really engaging in conversation with the paper authors is just the cross-cutting recommendations that came forward when we looked at those 6 papers that were drafted. And we have to credit here Jill Merriman, who's the consultant who synthesized the executive summary and these cross-cutting recommendations. So first here is that there is need to become more intersectional in our conceptions of men and boys. So far, the work with men and boys tends to be looked at very homogeneously, and we need to do better collectively to learn how varying identities, race, class, caste, sexuality, gender identity, geography, ability, and age, all of these facets and others influence men and boys, influence, as Lakshman was saying, the power and privileges that they hold, and also look at how marginalization works, and just not to treat the work with men and boys as copy and pasteable around the world, because people are different in different contexts. Of course, the second part, super important for Men Engage Alliance. We have identified this as one of our key areas of work, is really to strengthen our allyship with, collaborations with, and our accountability to the feminist, women's rights, LGBTQI rights, and youth movements. And we would love to talk a little bit more about that today as well. Also, what really came out, I think, in the times that we live in and the discussions that were had at the symposium, is the need to address underlying what we have been framing as feminist systems change. So the vision, the feminist vision for systems transformation. and not only to focus on the individual change, which is important. As you know, we have identified inner work for social change also as an important area of work. So focusing on individual behavior change is key also in the work with men and boys. But it needs to go further and deeper than that when we work on transforming masculinities and centering systems change agenda as it has been envisioned by the broader feminist movement. Decolonizing our knowledge and fostering and prioritizing learning from the global south and locally owned solutions. Many speakers brought this forward as well. It's important that we build movements that we contribute to movement building that are developed locally and with locally owned solutions. And to be very, very mindful that so far a lot of what has happened is that what works tends to be copy-pasted or prescribed from the global north on the global south, and that we really need to reverse that going forward. And we'll reverse that and work collaboratively. The focus on the climate crisis also emerged from the symposium discussions, of course, as a reflection of the times we are living in. And just looking at how gender transformative work with men and boys can contribute to climate justice is one of the ways that was identified, is to help men and boys understand how they can be allies and actively in their own lives work to achieve climate justice. Thinking through how gender transformative work with men and boys can be implemented digitally, including in response to the emerging backlash, like online spaces such as the manosphere, where men may go to for support and where they build anti-feminist attitudes. We need to do more to address those trends and to, in a way, offer alternative spaces for men that are talking about gender justice and feminist perspectives. And then lastly, summarized here, really key is not to just see youth as beneficiaries, but really as key stakeholders and leaders in the work. And I think the resurgence in a way of the feminist movement and the current climate justice movement are really showing us the importance of youth leadership and how much we have to learn. And so that was another key recommendation and outcome of the symposium discussions. And that was just a summary of the papers. Now we'll dive more into the papers individually, and passing it back to you, Lakshman, to start the first round of dialogue.
That's really, and again, once again, thank you to all the authors for such a comprehensive analysis of what came out from the conversation. And to sort of would like to hear more from your reflections as you have been, looking into many various recordings from the sessions, discussing and trying to understand what, people were talking from across the world when it comes to this work. So we wanted to hear from you on your experience while you were working on the papers itself, and share some reflections around them, and particularly looking at sort of areas where what really struck you as new and important insights when you were reviewing the recordings of the sessions to inform the papers that you were writing. But also, sort of, what do you think the symposium added some value to the discourse around the topic? Did you feel like, most of you have been part of in this journey with us throughout the work in the field with the symposiums as well? And what has really that led to and your experience? And also, given you are experts and leaders in your own areas of work and in the field of engaging boys and men, beyond the symposium, did you find or realize something were missing that you would have wished it would have been there in the sessions and discussions? So for the first round, we are inviting Rimjim, Nikki, and Peter to share your thoughts here. And again, it's a conversation, so feel free to whoever would like to start.
Okay, so thank you so much. It's really an honor and a delight to be here from New Delhi, to join you all from New Delhi. And to be able to reflect on the symposium sessions and the paper with this wider expert group. I reviewed, I think, more than 20 sessions. And my key takeaway was that throughout the symposium sessions that I reviewed, the work on ending gender-based violence was defined much more broadly. It was about addressing the many structures of society that perpetuate patriarchal masculinities. And there was a redefining of men's work on violence prevention within a transversal approach of working to disaggregate power in multiple ways. From my point of view, to break this down, I have some points that I felt came out clearly. Firstly, that it is essential to build shared political agendas. So having been one of those who was closely associated with the second Men Engage Symposium, which was held in 2014 in Delhi, it struck me that in the years since then, movements like the LGBT, climate, youth, racial justice movements, they have consolidated considerably. And these sessions brought out how imperative it is to build shared political agendas. Maybe to put it another way, that the agenda for an accountability-centered practice approach, which you mentioned earlier, Lakshman, it involves connecting with movements intersecting with multiple inequalities. And the sessions brought out that being accountable to the larger feminist struggle means positioning and advocacy of the men's work in the context of these other movements also. So towards climate justice, racial justice, economic justice with growing inequalities, and sexual rights, among other progressive agendas. There was this session, for instance, which discussed about how the men's work can become more intersectional and more political by aligning with the Black Lives Movement, and that we need to look beyond the traditional and redefine what is considered men's work to end GBV. Because gender-based violence is also a race issue, a criminal justice issue, and all of that. And secondly, what I found was very insightful and interesting, and different from the previous symposium also, was that the sessions talked about masculinities more broadly than only engaging men and boys. It used the lens of decolonization and intersectionality to examine global power and privilege imbalances. And again, as Yoni mentioned, that this has come out in multiple other papers also, the cross-cutting theme that perspectives from the diversity of the global South are not fully informing the work. And this is resulting in a loss of autonomy and ownership among activists and leaders in the leadership in the global South. And, not only in the global South, but also among other historically discriminated against communities. So the discussions engaged with issues of colonization in the world at large. And what was quite interesting was in this sector specifically, with considerable depth and richness of reflection. And, there were a range of recommendations about how to democratize knowledge processes at the community level, decolonize knowledge generation, and all of that. So I think, I'll hand over to the other panelists for now.
Thank you, Ranjan. Yeah, it's great.
Maybe I would join in. Great, thank you. Well, thank you, Lakshman, Bianca, and Yoni for the opportunity to be here. And of course, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from Washington, D.C. to everyone around who joined today. From my end, this symposium online sessions on particularly engaging men in peace building and countering militarism allowed for unprecedented level of discussions, reflections, and knowledge building. And I believe that by capturing the experiences and the lessons learned from projects and programs around the world and discussing approaches and strategies utilized across geographies and contexts and shared by the panelists, for me, the symposium highlighted actually not only how, in what way, and to what extent men have been engaged in peace building and countering militarism, or broadly speaking, men engaged in gender equality, but more importantly, perhaps, how much work lies ahead of our community in addressing the global rise of the far-right movements, ethno-nationalism, and populism, elements that today, perhaps more than ever in the history of our world, drive and sustain militarism and its associated militarist cultures and militarist masculinities. And I think that is something that was completely new and perhaps insightful for me. It's not just how, but rather how much work lies ahead of our community in doing the work that we do.
Nick, would you like to join in? Yeah.
shall I add to that? Yeah, I agree with both of what both of Rimjim and Peter had said, and thank you, Lakshman, Yoni, Bianca, and the team. It's been a privilege to be part of these discussions for the last year, and also to be part of the symposium itself. I mean, one of the things that really struck me, Rimjim was talking about the development since Delhi, is how many amazing feminist voices were there that I think haven't always been present. We've talked in theory about, grounding all the work in feminism, but I feel that the symposium really did do that. And there were lots of my absolute kind of feminist heroes there speaking. So, it was a very wonderful experience in that sense. I think too, the fact that we were all working together on these different themes, it became so clear that not only were your underlying themes of decolonization, intersectionality, accountability, etc., really, really important, but actually the links between our different themes became so evident. So I was talking about unpaid, writing about unpaid care, reviewing those 20 sessions on unpaid care, but thinking about care more broadly as well. I'm so conscious of that as we're watching what's unfolding in Ukraine at the moment, which feels like the opposite of care, that care isn't just for ourselves or our communities or our societies, it's also for the environment, it's also much more broadly. And it underpins so much else of what we do more generally. And it's also been much more obvious in the pandemic. So, lots of discussions about care and what that means. Before, it was more the purview of feminists and feminist economists, but there is increasing interest in what this means much more broadly, I think. And I think also in how men and boys and other gender identities as well can be part of this and can be included in it, in debates that go beyond redistribution, because I think often the program work with men and boys on unpaid care, which has been really important, but it's been very much about redistribution within the household and domestic work. And care in the home, rather than looking at gender equality more structurally in the wider care economy. And I think that the symposium began to do that, to look at what is a well-being economy, but what is an economy based on care, and to look at some of those other issues that, again, feminists have been looking at, but haven't really brought men and boys into that discussion. I guess partly because women still do the majority of caring all over the world. And then finally, the sessions I covered, and well as many others, affirmed that men and boys can do and must do the caring and care for others and themselves and societies and the environment and the planet if we're to build a healthy society. There are wider implications for care more broadly in terms of countering backlash, which I know Chantal would talk about, and promoting more careful world. And I love that the quote from the Ubuntu Declaration about the only path ahead is toward inclusion, equity, and justice, and a sustainable social economic order based on care. It's a path that must affirm our interdependent humanity and our universal human rights for everyone, everywhere. It feels like we're a long way from that at the moment for all kinds of different reasons, but that's where we're trying to get to, and care is absolutely at the heart of that. So I'll stop there.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. I think it's really nice to hear that what you all observed in terms of how this work has not really been only about kind of what men and boys can do, but more looking at and relocating men and boys within the broader structure, so that there is a sense of responsibility to sort of connect with the systems change agenda. And also, what I really enjoyed was how this work has really evolved to become more intersectoral work. One of the things earlier, if you remember, even in Delhi itself, Rimjim, you were part of organizing the symposium as well in Delhi. We saw there very fragmented, siloed kind of conversation on different themes such as GVV, SRHR, but then there was no interconnections between them. And we know how these things and lives of people, especially women, girls, gender identity, people of diverse identities, our lives are not siloed. They are intersectional, they are interconnected. And I think that's a beauty of what I'm hearing from you all, but also to look at this is a beginning. We are just opening the Pandora's box, and there is so much to be done as well moving forward. So it's not an end on itself and start celebrating and cheering up, but rather recenter in what we have found from these conversations to strengthen our efforts, works, and mobilization to become more and more meaningful and most importantly, do that in an accountable way and building partnerships with key feminist organizations. And I think within many years, that's been one of the areas. No, I think you all have been part of these processes for a while to help understand and strengthen partnerships and build solidarity with the feminist movements and feminist activists. So, yeah, anything anyone would like to build more on what you heard from each other? Maybe Rinjim, if you can, talk to the point of, you talked about the kind of what you observe was the in-depth and richness in the work that's been there. What does that really mean? And I see that Dario in the chat box have added that, this symposium has really provided new knowledge in the field. And particularly, working with men with intersectional approaches and the need to abandon naturalization of power relations with interpersonal ties, as well as public policies. So, speaking to that, again, that's also a richness that he's sharing. But if you can share more on what exactly you are finding on when you say richness.
Okay, so among the other things, one thing which came out very strongly as central to this work was also this very rich discussions in a way on how to incorporate greater gender and sexual diversity and to sort of discard and move away from gender binaries. So it's like almost a reframing of what Men Engage stands for. And, the Men Engage work, that programs and policies based on binary constructs must be questioned because they fuel this larger backlash against rights and inclusion. And I found that so many panelists explored that this field of work with men and boys must continuously sort of interrogate that it is not working in ways which reaffirm the gender binary, which has led to so much harmful masculinities. And, dismantling heteronormative power structures was very much seen as part of the GBV prevention work with men. And, just like Gitanjali Mishra had said, that there's been a reframing of what it means to be a woman or a gender binary, and that there's need to do that in the space of men and masculinities too. So since you mentioned policy work also, Lakshman, so I think it's very important for the movement to also hold governments to account, to hold policies and programs to account. And also this is additionally significant because of this whole anti-gender movement and the anti-gender actors, so to say, who are increasingly forging links and influencing political agendas, policies against things like sex education, for instance, and advancing homophobia and all the violence that comes with it. So I felt this was a framing that came out very clearly.
Amazing. Yeah, no, I think that's a brilliant point in terms of, challenging the heteronormative paradigm that most of our works usually fits in, and how this have. And yeah, thank you for reinforcing that. But also want to reiterate that, what was presented in the symposium was not only the work of Men Engage or Men Engage members, it was broader as well. And that was the beauty we found, is it was not just for, Men Engage members coming in, but people, who are not necessarily associated with Men Engage coming in openly to share. And that was quite an amazing, I think, space and opportunity. And I see there is a question to Nikki particularly, but, looking at particularly on, the connections with men caring more for the planet, and how do we shift focus from, just men as fathers kind of paradigm, but also looking at the historical women's economic empowerment frameworks, which sometimes work within the same, reinforcing the same neoliberal capitalist system. How do we address that, and what should we think of, or was there anything that came out?
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Good questions. I think probably the question on climate change will come up in more detail in Katrine's presentation. But clearly, when you start thinking about work on men and care, it is often talked about in terms of fatherhood. I'm going to talk about that a bit more later on. I think these broader framings, where care underpins such a lot of the other pieces of work, are really, really important, that we're not just talking about as you say, they're individual men, but we're looking at some of those structural changes. So I think we'll come to that in more detail a bit later, and I'm happy to pick up on it. I think your question around the women's economic empowerment framework, it depends who's framing it. I mean, certainly the feminist economists that I know of would equally challenge the kind of capitalist neoliberal systems and the way that reproduction and social reproduction are divided. People like Nancy Folbray. There's some really good work out there that really kind of which challenges the whole framing rather than just talking about women getting more women into paid work. And I think it's really important to continue to challenge that, to continue to think about, not just dividing paid and unpaid care, but thinking about what care is more generally. And I didn't talk, and I haven't talked. In fact, not very much in the symposium was around paid care workers, probably because that's a broader issue that the ILO and others have also looked at. But there's some reframing to be done there, both more broadly and in terms of men and boys' contributions. So both of those I think we can come back to as we continue the discussions. But thanks, Tim, for the question.
Yeah, no, thanks, Nikki. And we'll definitely come back. And we also need, go to the next round. Anything, Peter, you want to add before we invite the rest of the authors?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity again. I think maybe I will, from my end, add something that really struck me as a sort of a value added, something that perhaps also Jimmy and Nikki also alluded to, value added of some of the discourse and discussions that have happened during the online sessions that I covered. I mean, for me, first of all, a clear message came out that we as a community need to move beyond addressing only individual and perhaps focus more towards also institutional change. And that means that we need to focus on the institutional organizational structuring of male power, privilege, and supremacy, and address systems of power, generally speaking, and cultures, including by speaking and working with those who are power brokers, who are decision makers within these institutions. And I think that is something that is so particular to the military, to the conversation about engaging men in peace building and countering militarism. So working specifically with the military institutions, topic so important today's world as we see around the news. Secondly, that we as a community need to also do a little bit better formative research, better understand current political, economic, social, and technological factors and forces that actually drive some of those challenges related to engaging men, whether it's for gender equality, for climate change, or addressing militarism and its associated militarist cultures and militarized masculinities. And I think, thirdly, as something that have both of the speakers already addressed, I think when focusing on systems and structural change, we as a community really need to do so in solidarity with other gender and social justice movements. And that includes also addressing militarized patriarchal masculinities through the use of communication and online spaces. Again, both areas so important in today's world, and certainly through meaningful engagement with young people, not just as a beneficiary, but also as future leaders and decision makers and stakeholders. Again, something that I think is such a cross-cutting issue for all of the subjects and presentations and online sessions.
Absolutely. Yeah, with that, importance of intergenerational approach here, would like to pass on to invite the rest of the authors and pass it on to Yoni now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much so far. I'm so happy we have organized this conversation. We're having this. I'm taking such fervent notes. I think you're adding so many more insights to actually what was outlined in the paper. And it just made me realize how, I guess that within Men Engage Alliance, through the Ubuntu Symposium, we've come to the awareness of how interconnected all of the issues are that you've outlined. And how vast the problems are. And it almost feels a little bit in a way as perhaps the feminist movement, who's been tabling this for such a long time, is like, hello, welcome, to the conversation that we've been having for such a long time and what we've been pushing for. And I think, Rimjim, what you were saying at some point was, it feels like a moment of reframing Men Engage, or reframing the men and masculinities work, to address all of those broader issues. And it made me remember how Srilata Batliwala, a feminist activist from India, who we really look for guidance to, said after the Delhi Symposium in 2014 that one of the key outcomes was that patriarchy was centered as the problem. And now, in just listening to all of you and reflecting back on the symposium, I think what this did is saying, and it's capitalism, and it's racism, and it's the colonial system that we live in, and it's the broader political context, and we have to go beyond addressing the social norms and the interpersonal relationships and the individual behaviors to also the economic structures and the broader macro politics that are affecting us locally. So I really appreciate that. I just wanted to open it up now and invite Chantal and Jackie and Katrien to share any reflections on what you've heard so far. I mean, our guiding questions are: any new important insights from the sessions you've looked at? What did you think the added value has been so far of the symposium, but also what elements have you seen missing and we need to address going forward? And maybe may I invite first Chantal to share some perspectives.
Thank you so much, Yoni, and thank you, Bianca and Lakshman, for the opportunity. I felt like I got to write the most interesting paper out of everyone because backlash and fundamentalism related to all the things that everyone was talking about. So unpaid care work, gender-based violence, climate justice, militarism, sexual and reproductive rights. You found that there was a lot of backlash happening around all those areas. And I think the most important insight for me was the fact that this wasn't just limited to one region or one particular country. So even though you could see certain nuanced differences in terms of the regional context and cultural context, but you could see that this backlash and this backlash that was being experienced was sort of like a political strategy that was being used to increase confusion among the normal or ordinary people, and to sort of like redefine meanings around gender, and also to capture as well as just twist and re-signify what gender even means, and also to re-signify gender justice policy advocacy. So in one of the sessions, I think it was the hijacking gender session, Tessa talked about how the French anti-gender movement has been able to co-opt the language of gender, how they co-opted that language, even the language of the same-sex bill, to put forward their own agenda and to twist everything and to try and create this narrative around male victimhood and vulnerability. So just seeing those nuances, and I think Rimjim mentioned just now about how like the anti-gender movements have been able to forge links with the gender justice movement in a way to try and redefine meanings and to reinforce their own agendas. And these are things that they have been able to do in a way that's, I would say, indirect and kind of hidden, that if you're not careful, you won't really realize what's happening. But I felt like the symposium was able to shed light on a lot of those things. For example, anti-gender movements going to UN spaces and trying to influence the genders of what of the issues or the things that the UN has been spearheading. So to try and do that sort of discreetly in a way that we might miss it if we're not too careful, or how online spaces have been used to sort of capture young boys when they're still young and create this narrative around victimhood, so that young boys they exist in a world where they think, oh yeah, there's feminists are taking over. There's feminists are taking what belongs to us and creating this sense of entitlement and this sense of we are not doing anything bad, but we're just taking over our power that has been taken from us by these feminists or by these gender justice movements, which has created this narrative around young men and boys thinking, oh, we are just seeking justice for ourselves. And now they resort to things such as online, like hacking, threatening, doxing, and those kinds of things. So just being able to, I think what the most important insight was just being able to see those interlinkages in Backlash in terms of the climate justice movement, in terms of militarism, in terms of sexual and reproductive rights, and to just see those nuances, and most importantly, to just see how this wasn't just something that was done, like, oh, it just happened, but it's a political strategy that they have been using and they continue to use, and if we're not careful, it will just continue happening.
Thank you so much. And we'll get back for sure to what can we do about this. But before we do that, Jackie, Katrien, any thoughts from your side?
This is Catherine from Belgium. Chantal, I really appreciate what you say and what the other speakers have said, because indeed, maybe the most powerful thing about all the papers is that they converge towards one big central message. And Backlash is definitely a central story in it, because I think all of the movements are countering backlash, and all of us want to move beyond patriarchal stereotypes and find a way of shaping new masculinities and deconstructing these things. So I've been working on the paper on climate change there, and I want to start with one sentence. It's the famous sentence by Charles Darwin that says survival of the fittest. And I think it's one of the most misrepresented sentences in human history, or mistranslated, because very often people think the word fittest means strongest. And it's not true. It's the one who fits best into the system. And this, for me, summarizes what we have been saying in the seminars of Ubuntu on climate change and masculinity, is that we have to move away from a vision where man is supposed to be the strongest one, the dominant one, being in control of nature, towards a type of masculinities in plural, where you fit into a system, where where the emphasis is on care, on being connected, on interconnections in all of those ways. And definitely, this is a scary path for a lot of men, as was witnessed in a lot of the examples and projects that we talked about. And in that sense, I also very much liked what Nikki was saying, how destruction and care can be looked at as two opposites. Either you care, or in the complete opposite, like what is going on with the war, but also the destruction of the planet. It's about destruction. And so the whole question is, how can we move away from domination to care? I also resonate very much with what Peter was saying about the use also of military language in how it integrates our worldview, and we see that also happening with the climate change. Some men are on board already, in a sense that they realize climate change is real and we should tackle it, but then they remain in a view that they think they can solve it technically. And they think, we need engineers. And then they use things like, we will blast CO2 out of the sky, or we will fight climate change. And, again, it's very harsh words that do not resonate with a view where a planet is something that we care for, and that needs to care for us in a completely different way. So in many ways, we are all talking the same language, but using just slightly different words, but the core message is the same. And that, for me, was incredibly hopeful, to hear that, to sense that, and to feel that deep connection with the other movements, like the climate movements. They've had a terrible backlash with the whole fossil fuel industry subsidizing the breakdown of the climate movement. So, we could really resonate with the difficulties they had gone through, the resistances they had felt. And what I think is also very new here is that we can add the masculinity lens, because a lot of work has been done on women and children and climate change, because most often they are the victims. And we talk in climate change about MAPA, which is the most affected people and areas. And often these are women and children who live in vulnerable, poor areas. And so a lot of focus has been put on there. But in our seminars, we could really also put the masculinity lens. And then you very easily get to the point of the inconvenient truth, where you have to hold men accountable for what they have been doing with the planet. And how do we do that in a way that we don't scare men away and that they don't drop out? How do we do it in a way that, yes, we hold you accountable, but you're welcome to learn how to care for the planet? You know, it's always a bit of a difficult balance to bring that message, the inconvenient truth that, yes, some men are really destroying the planet, and we should talk about it and not shut up about it, and we should point them out in a way to change that. And I think that is very new. How can we get men on board and help them to listen to the inconvenient truth about their accountability and their destructive behavior? And how can we assist them in nurturing caring masculinities and in finding ways of starting to care for the planet? Okay, I'll leave it here now. Jackie, please.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's been so fascinating to hear from all the other authors. And one of the really wonderful things about working on this project was the opportunity to collaborate across such a diverse team of experts and perspectives. And I should also acknowledge that the paper I'm speaking to, I co-wrote with Tyler Crone, who, thanks to time zone, can't join us today, but it was, as always, a pleasure to work with Tyler. And I think one of the things that we grappled with in developing our own paper was that we had two topics, essentially, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. And of course, there's really important overlap between the two, but equally, it's really critical not to collapse the two into each other, because the breadth of issues under sexual and reproductive health and rights was very broad, that covered in the symposium, and equally, the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and queer people are much broader than just SRHR, and it would be a real mistake to think that the one equated to the other. And one of the key learnings really for us, or realizations as we worked on developing this paper, is that what the Ubuntu Symposium brought together was such a broad range of perspectives and also solutions. And it was really clear that that key theme of intersectionality, which is obviously absolutely critical and underpinning of the feminisms and the background that Tyler and I brought to this work, is equally important across all of the social justice movements that were represented within the symposium and that have been referenced in this discussion today. And particularly across the speakers in the symposium, we heard lots of perspectives around the need to really dismantle binaries in different spaces and different movements, and to ensure that in our own work, for example, many speakers spoke to the need for feminism to really throw open the doors of the tent and to really broaden to be properly inclusive of sexuality and gender diverse people, and particularly young people, and across all movements, to create space for really meaningful youth leadership. And that includes not just listening to young people, but permitting yourself to be led by young people, and to allow for issues to be shaped, for priorities to be framed, and for solutions to be generated by young leaders across all of these movements and networks. And something else that really resonated throughout the paper, and that we really throughout the symposium, and that we featured in our paper, was the impact of COVID-19. And of course, in many ways, the symposium was, the shift to being virtual really allowed for that diversity and that breadth and intersectionality. So many people were able to participate, and also participated from exactly where they were in their own lives, in their own communities, and also in their own interaction and experience with the pandemic. And I think that it was really interesting watching back through all the many sessions we reviewed to see how that affected what people brought into those spaces. I think, sometimes we might talk about, for example, care responsibility ways, but that's not quite as real as somebody's child running across the screen. I'm speaking to you today from, as you can see, a child's bedroom, which is also where I have my office. If we were meeting in person, I wouldn't have this visible baggage all around me and, you know, a giraffe growing out of my head and so on. But those responsibilities and that burden would still be there. And so I think what we saw was that, particularly perhaps in the conversation around sexual and reproductive health and rights, people really bringing their lived realities and lived experiences. And I think what it showed as well was having that context of COVID was that we talk about the march of social justice and this move towards progress and dismantling these intersecting systems that violate rights, that hold people back and that limit what we can achieve in terms of the change that we need to see. And I think what COVID showed was how fragile that progress is, how hard won and how easily lost it can be. And I'm thinking of, in my own context, two examples that have been on my mind recently. One, that during the COVID initial impacts, we had special permission and changes brought in from government to allow for abortion to be provided by telemedicine, for the initial consultations to be by phone and pills in the post, which massively dismantled barriers to particularly marginalised and excluded women and gender diverse people accessing abortion when they needed and wanted it. That has just been removed. Telemedicine has been removed. That will no longer be allowed now that, according at least to the UK government, COVID is over. And as a related point, I also learned that while contraception was protected during COVID, so if you wanted an IUD fitted, you would be able to access that in a clinic as you can now. But if you wanted an IUD removed, that was not permitted. And actually a friend of mine struggled for a long time through many, many clinics, phone calls and emails to find somewhere that would remove an IUD, because that wasn't contraception and therefore it wasn't protected as a right. But of course,
Jackie,
yes.
Could you share what is an IUD?
Oh, sorry, long-acting contraceptive, and in turn a coil, an intrauterine device. Sorry, I shouldn't use acronyms. I appreciate the reminder. And so there you have an example of you know, somebody somewhere has had the thinking like, we must protect access to contraception. That's a sexual reproductive right. But the idea that you should be able to have agency over removing that contraceptive and therefore being able to conceive, that wasn't protected. And so wherever we are, in whatever setting, in whatever context, there's a lot of work still to be done. But having said that, and having done this work for a while now, what I took away from the symposium was a real sense of optimism and hope that we know what to do and we have the tools, at least in our reach, if not yet in our grasp, and a real sense of intergenerational learning and cross-movement support and desire to collaborate more effectively and to ally more effectively and to really place the piece of engaging men and boys in that context, not as a solution or as a panacea, but as a way to do this that builds on what we've learned across movements and across settings and across issues, to build a more intersectional, more diverse, more collaborative approach that does at the same time fulfill sexual reproductive health and rights, ensure access to abortion, realise the full human rights of all trans and gender diverse people and all of the many barriers in the way, that overcomes conservative backlash, that responds to the current pandemic and prepares us for the next one, and addresses the climate crisis, amongst all of these other issues. And while that's a long and very incomplete list, and there's many things to add to it, I think what the symposium demonstrated was a way of bringing those things together and importantly, those people together in a way that allows us to start thinking about how to build that. And it's for the same reason really lovely to be here with you all today. And I'll stop talking now because we really want to hear from others. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Chantal, Jackie, Katrien. It just makes me think that in a way, and we reflected on that just as we were drafting the annual report over the last couple of weeks, that it has been a time, or we're living in a time where there is, on the one hand, I think, an awareness on the complexities and the increasing complexities of the world where we find ourselves in. And then the backlash that we're seeing kind of as part of that process. but also within Men Engage Alliance, there has been opportunity in a way over the last period to actually become aware of how all of those different trends are connected to how masculinities are shaped, what the roles of men and boys are, and an awareness that if we really want to go anywhere, we need to be connected and part of the broader feminist movement. Like it's been like the COVID-19 has made us see in a way, has elevated many of the crises. And it has made, I think, it has pushed us as a community of practice to be part of the broader movement of addressing all of these challenges. So I just find it's complex even to see that in crisis there has been opportunity, but and I would love to hear more about what you think needs to be done more going forward on the men and masculinities work. But I'll pass it back to you, Lakshman, to see what the next phase of the conversation can be.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe I think it's time to have all the authors on the screen so that we can build on to what we have been sharing so far, what we have been hearing so far. And I think I really liked how you summed up, Jackie, there are hopes and opportunities that we have identified, but also the importance of that is what exactly are we doing moving forward with those opportunities? Are we doing in a meaningful way to build on to those opportunities that we have been experiencing and prepare and become more stronger together in terms of really standing to counter the kind of backlash and the restrictive environment we are facing at the moment. So yeah, I think there are some questions as well on the chat box, and then now on the issue of backlash, there has been also been driven by fear and insecurities. But interesting point in the backlash or even the militarization is also what we have seen in the context of Middle East, for example, or Africa, and in South Asia as well, where I think there has been a real shift in the way the traditional norms are being of what is it called, women in the traditional terms have been challenged, where women and girls have been playing the role of providers in the family. So I think there are those other opportunities that we heard on how the challenging of gender roles can take place as well. Yeah, I think, I would love to, again, bring you back. Anyone would like to jump in here?
Sorry, I raised my hand. Can I just come in?
Mridul, yes.
This is Mridul Epan. I mean, I'm just sticking my neck out because I really haven't attended any of your symposiums, but I've been off and on attending some, webinar like this. And I am with the Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum, Kerala. And last year, I was with the State Planning Board in Kerala, and we were doing a lot of schemes and programs on gender equality. And of course, we realized very much that without engaging men, gender sensitization, gender awareness does not make any sense at all. So you have to get the men in. So I'm speaking in a very basic way because I know you all have gone much, much beyond what I'm saying. But the problem which I've been finding, just thinking about it, we've tried very hard to include men in all the sensitization classes that we have in government offices, in the police, in the judiciary, somehow or the other, where the important decisions are made on issues of gender justice. So, but I was just thinking, why is it that on the one hand, we're struggling so hard here, but on the other, masculinity is increasingly being also connected with what somebody was mentioning, survival of the fittest or the physically strong. And we see that reflected so much in cinema. I mean, it's amazing, how violent and how masculine cinema is getting, And of course, the fact that men think that, they have to have brawn, with those, the gyms and everything that's coming so much into the picture. So I was just thinking, is it, I mean, as part of your work, of course, I have not done much on it, now, but focus on areas where masculinity seems to be coming back in the way we don't want it to, coming back in a big way. So is the visual media somewhere we should work upon? Why is it happening that the films are getting more violent? They're getting, more physically, and anger. How much anger men show, and that they have the right to get as angry as they want in all the films that we see nowadays. So one thing could be focus on something. Otherwise, we keep talking about intersectionality and things like that. But I think we should focus on where we find things are not happening in the way we want it to.
Yeah,
because I'm more practical, having been in the planning board, we are really more practical in that sense. So I am stopping here. I'm sorry. My comments may be very, very, naive, but I just, some thoughts that I had.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
We'll build on that. Thanks, Mridul.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Yeah. Any reflections from, Catherine?
Yes, I think we all recognize that. I think when we talk about transforming masculinities, you can do it both ways. You can say, let's concentrate on what we want less. And this is exactly the type of masculinity that Mridul was describing. A lot of anger and hyper masculinity on TV shows and in movies. But you can also transform people by focusing on what you want them to become. And that works a lot better, to focus on what you want. And I'm just going to share one good practice that was in the paper on climate change. And this is such a special thing in the current context because it is a Russian project. And we all know what is going on in Russia right now. So in Russia, they started fatherhood groups, and they would get men together who are fathers and to start talking about care for the planet and to explain them. And it were simple things like, how do you sort your garbage, paper and biodegradable things, and et cetera. So they started to talk about recycling. Then they started to talk about community, about the importance of having green spaces in the community. And eventually they got all the men to start taking initiatives in their local municipalities together with their children. And the aspect that the men were doing it with their children, these little ecological projects, like one guy was making a compost pile, and another one was building a local park and growing some vegetables there. And the fact that they did it with the children was so important because it was also working on the transformation on how they were fathers. And then they started to look at the relationships that these men had with their wives, and how could they transform that into a more caring relationship. And I really very much enjoyed that good practice example because it connected the care, fatherhood, paid and unpaid care, voluntarism, with climate change and with doing the proper climate work. And it was really focusing on what we want to become as men and not so much on what we want to get rid of. And I think that works as a strategy very much. And I think the real change in the world is done by little people here and there who make these very small changes, and they slowly start to spread like, an oil spill and eventually touch everyone. And I highly believe in that approach.
Yeah. Thanks, Catherine. Chantal, I see your hand up.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Lakshman. And Catherine is right to say that real change happens and it comes from small steps or small actions that are taken by normal and regular people. And at the end of the day, it all culminates into something big because it started from those small actions. And in terms of like I was looking at in the chat box, and I saw Jan was talking about how the more successful activism we have, the more backlash we'll see, which is very true, because I think the more we're seeing this backlash, it shows that we're doing something right. So we need to continue at it because no one wants to attack something that is not working. So the more backlash we see, we know that we're definitely doing something right. And in terms of what can be done, I found one interesting thing that I found during the symposium and in my research was that the reason why all those anti-gender movements have been successful is because they realize the importance of cross-movement building. And in the symposium, there was a discussion around how fascist movements, fundamentalist and populist forces, before they were just working in their silos, but they realized the importance or the power of cross-movement building. And so now they started working together. They were funding each other. They were accessing positions of authority and positions of power. And because of that, now they've been able to have more access than they had than they used to have before. And they've been able to do all those things that they've been doing because they were able to come together and engage in transactional ways in such a way that they managed to have more impact. And now I was thinking, now imagine, so as the gender justice movement, we have already been doing that. As feminist movements, we've been doing that. But now imagine if we went to that bigger scale of realizing the power that we have when we start working together. Imagine how much impact we can be able to have. And also in terms of how those fascist movements, the fundamentalists and the populist forces, they seem to have this one universal message. And it made me think about the importance of messaging and creating messages together. How do we do that as feminist movements? How do we create the same messaging, or how can we be able to create one type of message or one kind of message? How can we be able to use the resources that we have together, share the resources that we have together, and be able to create this similar messaging that is very identifiable and that will be able to bring even people or men that are on the fence? How can they be able to relate to that kind of messaging and being able to say, oh, actually, I think I need to be able to do this? And I think the last thing is the agency around boys and young men, because with the discussions on online movement, with the discussions on militarism, you find young boys and young women, young boys and young men going around using guns against feminists. You see young boys and men going on these online spaces and just spreading so much hate. And you think, this is just a young boy, this is just a young man. So when you see those young boys and young men being able to do that, how can we realize that they have agency, and how do we create messaging around, or messaging that is able to attract young boys and men so they can be able to know and identify their agency and be able to use that in a way that amplifies our messaging, in a way that amplifies our work, and in a way that creates societal change globally. Yeah, I think that's what I have to say.
Thanks. The next in the list I see is Rimjim.
So I think related to what Mridul raised, some of the points which Mridul raised, as well as what Jan has put in the chat, some of the gap areas, or I won't really say gap, maybe some greater opportunities based on things like, the media was one area which, at least in the sessions which I went over, as well as the ones that the ones I had also attended a lot of sessions, apart from the ones that I was supposed to review. So I did not see any very in-depth, from my point of view, sort of analysis of the influence of the media on masculinities and, that whole thing of doing advocacy with the media, which can be really, really powerful, because as Mridul said, how do young men and boys construct their masculinities? The media, the public media, the mass media, the entertainment media, news media, all of them are interconnected, and this can be a very enormous area of influence. The second thing, which again I feel is a greater opportunity, and maybe because now from my position of being in the government, partly I felt that stronger intergovernmental processes could potentially be a key focus area. So in the sessions that I looked at, again, definitely there was, the regional men engage partners and all were engaging at their own level with the governments. But I felt that there could be a need for holding sort of to account national governments. There is still need to build capacity of governments to understand working with men and boys. And all of this will also help to increase the commitment on the issue. So this thing of targeting policymakers, examining the role of the state, this is part of this whole work of strengthening multi-stakeholder accountability in a way in the masculinities work. So engaging more with countries at the government level, examining more the role of the state and its institutions, and also the GBV perpetrated by the state. It's like it's not just the non-state actors and institutions, but also we have to hold the governments also accountable through things like legal policy and programmatic changes. So, for instance, some of the suggested frameworks could be influencing the governments to include work with men and boys in national action plans on prevention and in gender policies, or setting up more intergovernmental bodies and processes and helping states to implement these policies and standards through different partnerships, because governments do have a huge scope to bring about quite radical changes. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Rimjin, for that. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So we are slowly moving into what the question that was there, but also there is a question also with regards to militarization also moving into the space around women and women being co-opted within these militaristic institutions and mechanisms. Peter, probably that's a good segue to you.
Thank you very much. In fact, I would love to maybe build on what Catherine has said about maybe the shifting the focus of what we want men to become rather than identifying the problems and challenges that they create or are part of. And certainly what Chantal have mentioned that struck me very well, how do we do it? And I think from my perspective, and also perhaps answering some of the questions online and some of the comments that are already in the chat, to me, it is clear and evident that the symposium and the online session on the topic not only consolidated, but also provided a really wonderful platform for sharing experiences and discourses and really highlighting the state of the field of engaging men in my case of my paper, peace building and countering militarism. But I think the symposium left me and perhaps others also longing for more practical examples of how we as community can better translate into practice the very effective and proven strategies to engage more individual, regular men, if I can use that word, regular men for gender equality, and focus on engaging particularly with powerful leaders, decision makers, power brokers within and outside the military institutions. And a colleague and a very good friend of mine mentioned and made a great comment on the chat, Tim Shant, about the fact that the richest men in the world own more than GDPs of multiple countries. So how do we move our work and how do we step into the space of working with those power brokers and leaders that do have the power to make the difference? And I want to emphasize once again, I think that also was part of a discussion of online sessions that I addressed and have covered, that much of the work on addressing patriarchal and in this case militarized masculinities have very much focus on individual men, often in the global south and from poor communities. And I, and perhaps others, were left wondering how men in the global north, and in particular male, who are once again the power brokers in leadership and decision-making positions in powerful institutions, multinational organizations, including the military itself, can better, more strategically and more practically be engaged in peace building, countering militarism, but also other justice, social justice issues, climate change, something that Catherine has mentioned as well. And I think what we need is literally another symposium that would start a conversation about how the field of men for gender equality in solidarity and unity with broader gender and social justice movements can transform the unjust, unequal political, economic, sociocultural systems of power that not only introduce, strengthen, and sustain patriarchy and militarism or militarized masculinities, but also threaten, and I think this is really, really important, threaten progress on all human rights, including women's rights, LGBTI rights, as well as progress on gender justice, climate justice more broadly.
Thank you. And I see we have our speakers already ready to share. So Jackie, please go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to respond quickly to the question from the chat about missing issues, and I apologise I'm taking us on a segue from what has been such a rich and important discussion. I've got loads I'd like to say in response to some of the points that have been raised, but I think it's really important to highlight this one piece that for me really stood out as not being present in the symposium discussions, which was really around understanding sexual and reproductive health and rights, but also other rights across the life course and at different stages. And it speaks to the risks I mentioned earlier of creating new binaries and enforcing new binaries. So we had a really critically important focus on youth. And as part of that, there was a real priority placed on issues around menstruation with a focus on younger women and adolescent girls. But what I didn't hear come up across the symposium was any real discussion around menopause and of aging. And when we talk about many different issues that have been mentioned today, older women might be more affected, differently affected, and in some cases are missing from the data. So often GBV data is not inclusive of women and gender diverse people over often very low cutoff ages. But no one of any age should be excluded from that data. And we're not going to be able to address these issues unless we take a properly intersectional across the life course approach. And as much as there was this really important discussion of dignified menstruation, we also need to be thinking about dignified menopause and making sure that there's spaces within these discussions, within the next symposium and so on, for discussions around older people's experiences. And when we talk about shifting norms and shifting individual behaviours and creating a new way to be and a way to interact with each other, I think we often, for reasons that kind of make sense, we often sort of think about children and young people. But actually, if you want to really shift norms and you want to look at where the power sits in a society, we have to think about how we change things for older people as well, and change the minds and the inclusion of older people as well. So it's really important to include that. So, thanks.
Thank you, Jackie. And please go ahead, Nikki.
Yeah, I'll be quick because I know we've got to finish. And I just so many good points, and I could talk for a long time. I guess I'm just picking up one thing really, and that's around individual change and structural change. And a lot of that is about power and about thinking about structures in terms of power, but also thinking about individual men's power. And maybe my best way of finishing is just a quote from Nyadari Gumbonzanda, who's the former General Secretary of the World WCA, and she was in part of the symposium. And she said, there are too many good men in the world who are doing nothing to dismantle patriarchy, and yet you profess to be doing great stuff. This speaks to some of the questions coming up today. There are too many in positions of responsibility who are irresponsible. They are the majority of leaders, parliamentarians, religious leaders, doctors, etc. So when we ask where are the men are there, but they're not making the decisions that advance gender equality, human rights, and dignity. It's not about involving or including men. It's about everybody in positions of responsibility using their power responsibly. And I think that's such a good summing up of some of the issues around empowered power. And Tim's just talking about kind of, again, the men in power making those decisions. And we have to think about how we influence that, as well as working with programs on the ground. I'll stop because we've got to finish, but thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think from that analysis, what we do see when we analyze who are the people in power, that very, very often, though they are men, and several of you have pointed that out. And I think for me, among the many, many key takeaways has been why we also say that we have to work decolonized and not bring the answers or solutions or initiatives from the North to the global South. I think there's the times that we find ourselves in, there's a really clear responsibility from those of us in the global North to hold our own power holders to account, because a lot of the trends that we've discussed today do emerge from power inequalities that are held also by the global North. And I think that's important to acknowledge. And I think it's a call also to our alliance members, those of us who are in the global north, to look at our own contexts and what can we do there. And I think that also involves changing public opinion, because as we've talked about in Backlash, the way people are voting, the appeal for many young men to the incel movement or online messaging that is not helpful, that's anti-feminist. There's a lot that we have to do in a way to hold our fellow men and communities that we live in to account, and to become part of the movement. So for me, that's another key takeaway has been the importance of continuing on intersectional feminism, centering that, unpacking that, and building or being part of working in allyship with all these various movements that we've talked about that are working for economic justice, for climate justice, and for intersecting, I think, gender justice throughout all of those. And we will really continue to center movement building going forward. And with that, I want to pass it on to Lakshman. I know we have, just to close up, one slide that we wanted to show you with just a little bit of the things that we will be committing to going forward, building further on the symposium outcomes. And I'm not sure, Bianca, if you're still with us to show that slide.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, everyone. And this has been, I would have wished to continue doing this, but we are around the time. We are already 3 minutes over. So thank you for bearing with us. But also, I think one of the takeaway from the conversation today is the challenges we are outlining in terms of questions and sharing in terms of what are missing also has to do with the way this work is framed. Generally, unfortunately, or for some reason, these programs or efforts are framed within the international development sector and a framework. And that is leading to kind of NGOization of this kind of topics that we are talking, that limits our ability to really, move or put our efforts from a movement building perspective or social change perspective, and sort of work in a more cohesive way. And I think that's something I really wish that we can push more for, more of a movement building approach rather than considering these as development projects, which they are not. These are issues of human life and human dignity and rights, and that those issues are not just project issues. These are way beyond projects. And I think, how do we inculcate this framework and thinking in the work we are doing? And I think for many years, and you, some of you who probably I'm now realizing know us, maybe already clear of who Yoni and I are. We introduced the authors, but I realized we didn't. So we are with Meninges Global Secretariat, as we are the two co-directors at the Secretariat. So I think the next step for us is really to continue this conversation. This conversation with the authors is the beginning, and we will continue, which we are actually already started. Some of you may have seen that with the phased launch of each of the papers that we talked about today. That will accompany with social media campaigns and outreaching our members at all levels, but also working with our members to sort of amplify these questions, these conversations, the frameworks, the recommendations, to make them very practical as actions that our members can do in their own context, depending on what would be their priorities and would be the entry points to sort of move from individual-oriented, behavior change-oriented approach to more systems-oriented approach. So that connecting with the systems change agenda. And I think that's also something we have been looking into as we continue, from last year, implementing our new strategic plan. And the orientation is more of intersectoral, holistic, and partnership, and in solidarity, move towards systems change agenda. And in order to do that, we are also taking it a little more structured in a way as a approach that we are actually unpacking what that actually will mean, something like a learning collaborative, so that we can continue creating these spaces where we can come, share, and help and understand each other more and connect more, And also, and while we are talking about decolonization, it's also important at the same time that we work and take the leadership from our own members at the country level as well. So we will work to contextualize these papers in different areas of the world and work with our members, country networks, and regions to further localize is what the term we are using, but not, sort of not to go into mere jargons, but build on to the expertise and grounding realities that we have in the country level to inform what we as an alliance then will prioritize and move forward as well. And next slide, maybe, I think, and that's what we aspire to do moving forward with the implementation of our new strategic plan. And what you shared will keep this in mind to inform our next steps in relation to how we implement our annual plans and strategic plan moving forward. And we wish to remain in touch with all of you as well in this work, without which I don't think we will, be strong enough to continue this discourse. And we do need to work together as we move forward. And one good realization Santhal brought up was, if the opposition or anti-rights movements are working so closely together and in an amazing way so that they are becoming more stronger, we have to realize that we need to work together, keeping aside small, disagreements that we may have, but our overall aim is same. So I think it's time and moment that we come together in partnerships, in solidarity, and work from a movement building perspective and join hands to push the kind of backlash we are experiencing these days. Yeah, and Yoni, over to you. Anything you would like to add?
No, nothing to add, just to really thank our speakers and the participants as well. I think we had a little bit of conversation also happening in the chat. Mm-hmm. And it just feels like we have to keep on creating the spaces. Lakshman referenced the Learning Collaborative. I mean, we've resourced so much knowledge and analysis through the Ubuntu Symposium, but we're also aware that we need to, within Men Engage Alliance, support kind of the ongoing learning and application of what we're learning into practice. And so we're thinking through how to continue these conversations and supporting membership in practice more structurally. And thank you for being part of the Alliance. I learned a lot, and I feel very challenged by what's happening in the world, but I also feel very privileged to be part of this community where it turns out we are increasingly, I think, sharing shared analysis. And that, I think, like Lakshman was saying, we have to join hands. That's making us more powerful. So we have to believe that we are making a difference, and we will be making a difference, and we will transform, if I can be hopeful, going forward.
Absolutely.
But there's a lot of work to do.
And working together makes us easy, right? I think. And with that, keeping our thoughts with people in Ukraine at the moment, what they are experiencing, we again would like to thank you all for making out your time to join us today. Your contributions have been amazing and really, really appreciated, and the conversations we are having. And we will continue reaching out to you all for more conversations as you may find applicable. Also learn among other actors beyond this group as well, and continue the figuring out of some of the questions we may have for now. Thank you all, and also thanks to Bianca and the Global Secretariat team for making and arranging and coordinating this session, and also Tom on the backhand side, who is doing a lot of communications outreach at the moment while we are speaking. So thank you all, everyone, for making this a reality. And we will be in touch.